Just imagine a busy street, people are going about their business, and suddenly a blatant act of aggression that no one expected to see. A white woman suddenly pounces on an elderly black woman, striking her. But what happens next is shocking to everyone. The elderly woman is not just going to stand there and suffer humiliation. She responds to the attack with determination, and real fear flashes in the eyes of the aggressor. Greetings to each and every one of you watching this video. We are very interested to know where you are watching us from. Write your name and city in the comments. We read every comment and want to know you better. Your support is invaluable to us because you are the ones who help our channel grow and spread important stories. We sincerely thank you for each of your messages, likes, and subscriptions. You are our real strength, and we appreciate you incredibly. Enjoy the show. The city was bathed in sunlight, as if nature itself wanted to create an illusion of calm and benevolence. Warm rays penetrated through the green branches of the trees, filling the street with patches of light and shadow, and a light breeze carried the smell of fresh baked goods from the cafe around the corner. The people around them were busy with their daily activities. Some were hurrying about their business. Some were chatting on the phone, as if the whole world was immersed in routine and worries, paying no attention to the passersby. An elderly black woman walked along the sidewalk, leaning on a cane, her gait measured and calm. Her eyes expressed the wisdom that comes with age and a slight sense of fatigue. It was just another ordinary day for her, a stop at the drugstore, then the grocery store, and perhaps a chat with an old friend on the phone on the way home. But her presence somehow caused a stir in one of the passersby. A blonde, middle-aged woman. Her gaze was cold as ice when she noticed the older black woman. The aggression that literally lurked in her face erupted from the depths of the dark prejudice and hatred she had been indoctrinated with since childhood. Like a shadow, the woman watched the elderly lady, her irritation growing with each step, like a rising hum in an empty room. A sunny day would have seemed normal, but in this sudden gloom, something confused the passersby, the presence of aggression, the source of which was the silent but sharp gaze of a white woman who outshone the rays of the sun and disturbed the calm. The elderly black woman, absorbed in her own thoughts, did not even notice how her presence provoked a deafening rage in the white woman standing nearby. The blonde woman looked at her with such contempt, as if her very life was a humiliation to everyone around her. Her gaze became piercing, filled with something dark and stale, like a rusty wound that didn't want to heal. The white woman didn't understand where her hatred was coming from. It was enough for her to see the color of the elderly lady's skin to bring up all the stereotypes and prejudices she had absorbed over the years. What is she doing here? How dare she walk down the same street as me? Ran through her mind. Disdain and anger swept over her mind like a wave, and with each passing second these feelings intensified, as if the older woman's mere existence was a challenge to everything she thought should be hers alone. The blonde woman's hard, cold gaze was directed straight into the older woman's eyes as she turned around for a moment. For a brief moment their gazes crossed, and in that collision everything that the white woman had so fiercely hidden inside was revealed. Her eyes glittered with contempt and a deep dislike that made her feel cold even under the blazing sun. The old woman, catching that look, frowned for a moment, as if she felt the force of that hatred piercing her like sharp shards of ice. She didn't need to hear the words the white woman's gaze spoke for her. You are nothing. You have no right to be here. Go back where you came from. This silent exchange of glances was filled with indescribable cruelty, a painful reminder of how sometimes an ordinary existence in someone's eyes can become an occasion for hatred. The white woman felt the anger boiling inside her, searching for a way out. A glance was not enough. She had to express her contempt in words, to put her hatred outward, to make the older woman feel it fully. She stepped a little closer, at the edge of her range, and turning to the black woman, she mockingly said, loud and clear enough for those around her to hear, "Why don't you go back to where you came from? You don't belong here," she said coldly, smirking, her arms crossed over her chest, clearly expecting a response. Her tone, venomous, was designed to strike a nerve. The older woman frowned, trying to figure out if she had really heard those words, or if her mind was trying to ignore such an insult. She looked up and met her eyes with aggressors. Sadness and weariness were evident in her eyes, but behind them was a sense of dignity that had helped her endure such humiliation for years. "I beg your pardon," the older woman asked calmly but firmly. Though her heart was pounding louder than usual, Her voice, unlike the white woman's intention, did not sound frightened or resigned, but strong. The white woman snorted and shook her head, curling her lips in a contemptuous grin. "Oh, you heard perfectly well," she said with more coldness. "You're always getting in the way, as if it weren't enough for you already own the streets, the stores, the transportation, as if we have to put up with it, eh?" The people around her, hearing this tirade, began to whisper, but no one intervened. Their gazes were directed at the older woman, as if they were waiting to see how she would react. This assertive aggression, spewing out with every word of the white woman, was aimed directly at her soul. "You don't like something," the older woman answered calmly, not losing her composure. Although every cell in her body was screaming at the unfairness of what was happening, she knew it would be better to leave, but she realized that if she gave in now, it would only confirm her opponent's insolent confidence. The white woman grinned upon hearing the answer and leaned forward slightly and hissed through her teeth, "You don't get to ask the questions here, old woman. You should be thankful you're tolerated here at all." These words were like blades that stabbed deep into the old woman's heart. Anger, humiliation, and bitterness struggled in her soul, but she knew that to give in now would be to give this woman the right to continue to humiliate others. The white woman, feeling a surge of gloating pleasure at the way the elderly black woman stood before her, remaining calm and proud, felt the need to break her down completely. She took a few steps forward, ostentatiously invading the elderly woman's personal space, and suddenly shoved her roughly with her shoulder, causing the elderly woman to stagger and take a step backward to keep her balance. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said with a mocking grin, pretending that she pushed her by accident. But there was an open challenge in her gaze that demanded a response. "I hadn't expected the old woman to be so clumsy." The older woman met her eyes again, trying to understand what was causing this man to behave with such open cruelty. But the white woman only grinned even wider, seeing that look, which was far from fear. "You think you can look at me like that?" She grinned, as if she'd said something funny, and stepped forward again, deliberately blocking the way. "You and people like you look at us with pity all the time, as if your opinion means something. Trust me, no one cares what you think. We're in charge here, after all these years. Don't you get it?" The insult spoken to his face echoed down the street, and curious glances from passersby were already gathering around. Some looked around anxiously, but most seemed to prefer to pretend that nothing was going on. "You are so desperate to take a place that doesn't belong to you," the white woman continued, her voice growing louder, as if she were addressing not only the older woman, but also the people around her who were now listening to her words. "Everyone always wants something from us, wants to use what we have built. But no, you have no right to stand here as equals. And believe me, you never will." The old woman stood silent, her cane clenched in her hand. She could feel that it was becoming increasingly difficult for her to hold back. But there was no fear or submission in her gaze. She knew perfectly well that this woman expected her to remain silent in humiliation, or to make a desperate attempt to justify herself in order to show her superiority once more. "You're not even going to answer," the white woman said, her voice sharper, clearly wanting to get words out of her that could be turned against her. "Of course, don't say anything. You're not used to obeying, are you? Isn't that why you're here?" She said the last words so loudly and with such disdain that some passers-by couldn't stand it and nodded approvingly, as if this woman's racist words only confirmed what they themselves thought. The impatience and anger boiling up in the white woman reached its climax. She expected to see fear, weakness, or humiliation on the older woman's face, but instead she was confronted with a silent, unwavering gaze. It was as if the gaze reflected a lifetime of pain, overcoming, and pride, and there was not the slightest trace of resignation in it. This finally enraged the white woman. A dark desire to break her, to make the other woman feel that she belonged here, on this street, in front of her and in front of everyone, flashed through her mind. Words were not enough, and she took another step forward. Then, almost without thinking, she struck the older woman's face with her fist. The crack of the impact pierced the air, instantly silencing those around him. The elderly woman staggered from the impact, her cane falling out of her hand and hitting the pavement with a clatter. She barely stayed on her feet, clutching her face where a hot pain was growing. Her whole world swam before her eyes for a moment, and she felt the ground beneath her shake. The white woman smiled, seeing her superiority, seeing how her actions had done what her words could not. Her face expressed pride. and she felt victorious. It seemed that with each blow she asserted her right to show hatred, as if this cruel act was justified by her beliefs. "See," she said, her voice full of triumph, "this is your place, down here. You should be ashamed of yourself for even daring to be around it." The crowd that had been watching in silence frowned. Some took a step back, some turned away as if they had seen nothing, but no one dared to intervene. Racist looks like the aggressors were also in the eyes of the others. They remained silent and watched as the impunity of her actions increasingly confirmed her own right. The older woman, gathering her last strength, slowly straightened up, barely able to stand, but still staring into the face of the one who had just struck her. Her gaze was no longer just steadfast. There was pride, protest, and the memory of the past she had gone through to live to see this day. The white woman couldn't destroy that, no matter how much she tried. A small crowd formed around the incident, people, mesmerized by what was happening, frowned as if during an unplanned performance. Some took out their phones to capture the moment, but instead of helping, they just watched, as if the feast fighting scene was playing out on a TV screen somewhere, not in real life, in front of their eyes. The witnesses exchanged glances, whispering among themselves, hesitant to intervene. Some of the eyes were troubled, but most were indifferent, believing it was none of their business. One of the men, with a wry smile on his face, said, "Yeah, she's got it in for her. Right on." This comment elicited a few laughs, and the crowd, though tense, began to show interest, as if expecting the show to continue. Others, a little more sensitive to the situation, snorted and grumbled, but no one made an attempt to intervene or call for order. "Well, that's not exactly good," an older man muttered, crossing his arms over his chest. "But maybe it's her own fault. Why mess with her at all?" His words sounded like an excuse, and soon everyone forgot that it was the white woman who had started the humiliation. Loud whispers and quiet discussions created a tense atmosphere, but there was nothing in the way of action. Fear of the possible consequences, both for the white woman and for those who might intervene, hung in the air like an invisible poison. The elderly black woman, still holding her cane in her hand, felt the stares of the people around her. Some of them were full of judgment, others of bewilderment, and only a few of sincere sympathy. She looked around for support, but, to her deep disappointment, she found no one willing to intercede. The white woman, realizing that the crowd was taking her side, turned to them with an arrogant grin. "You see, no one's even going to stand up for this." She paused, searching for an insulting word. "Old woman, someone like her isn't even worth wasting time on." This only spurred the others around them to start looking around, exchanging approving glances, as if they themselves had a chance of avoiding a similar embarrassment if they just turned away. The elderly woman, feeling the humiliation overtaking her, could hardly take a step forward. She could no longer afford to be a victim in this theater of the absurd, where no one cared about the truth, but the gap between her inner strength and the outside world around her seemed impassable, and even her own resolve was beginning to weaken. The elderly woman, trying to keep her balance after the blow, suddenly felt her legs become wobbly under her. In an instant, she lost her footing and, struggling to hold her cane, collapsed to the ground. The sound of pavement hitting pavement was deafening, but all around the moment seemed to freeze as her body touched the ground. The crowd held their breath as they watched her fall. Some of the faces were concerned, but most were still indifferent, as if it were a scene from a movie rather than real life. The old woman felt the cold earth touching her skin, and with each passing second, the touch became more painful. It was hard to believe it. Here she was, at the end of her days, on the ground, humiliated and insulted. But her eyes, full of pain, burned with determination. They remained clear and penetrating, despite everything that had happened. This woman, who had been through more than one hurricane in her life, knew that at this point, her inner world was far more important than her outer circumstances. Trying to minimize her suffering, she looked at the white woman, who stood cross-legged, with a smile of smugness on her face. But something more than just a desire for revenge was brewing inside the elderly woman. A feeling was ripening in her heart that this time, it wouldn't just end this way. "You think you can break me," she said, though her voice sounded a little hoarse, as if it were coming out of the depths of her soul. "You don't realize that real strength isn't in hitting, but in getting up despite the blows." As if in response to her inner thoughts, the white woman only grinned, savoring the moment of triumph. "Look, everyone can see who's really weak here," she said with a venomous sneer. "You can't even fall down without help." But there was a glow in the older woman's eyes that was hard to explain. It wasn't a simple feeling of aggression or hatred. It was the realization that there had been more than one or two moments in her life when she had had to get up after falling. With each obstacle, she had only gotten stronger. She pondered whether to fight back, and though fear and pain raged in her heart, the desire to stand up for herself and those who could not was growing inside. Kneeling down, she felt every vein of her body, every pain, but with every moment, she found the strength to keep fighting. Gathering her strength, the old woman slowly rose up, as if every cell of her body was striving to show that she was still here. Her gaze was enough to realize that the struggle was not only her own, but the battle of all those who had ever experienced humiliation, who had ever felt weak and depressed. She was ready to step forward, even though everyone around her was watching warily, and the white woman was only eager for her defeat. The old woman gathered her strength and slowly got to her feet. There was no longer any sign of fear on her face. There was a determination in her eyes that was like a flame ready to engulf everything around her. She looked around at the crowd, which had frowned in anticipation, and felt a power rising that she hadn't even realized was there. A voice inside her rang out, "Don't be afraid, act." The white woman, amazed that her victim was still standing, briefly lost her confidence. She had not expected the older woman to dare to confront her. Bewilderment flashed across her face, but then it became hard as stone again. In response to this bewilderment, the older woman stepped forward, her confident movements filled with new energy. "You can try to humiliate me all you want," she said, her voice clear and loud, "but you can never break my soul." They were words that made the hearts of the crowd clench. They held their breath in anticipation of violence, as if the whole situation had frozen for a moment. Then, in an instant, the elderly woman raised her cane and swiftly pointed it toward the white woman. It was not just a retaliation. It was an act of resistance, a vivid manifestation of her spirit. The cane swung powerfully into the air and struck the white woman on the shoulder, forcing her to retreat. At the same moment, fear coursed through her body. She didn't expect that this weak woman could hurt her. The older woman, full of anger and determination, wasn't going to stop. "I am not afraid of you," she shouted, and her voice was full of passions, anger, determination, justice. With each passing second, she felt her power growing, and with it the fear of the white woman, who finally began to realize that her actions could have unpredictable consequences. Shaken, the white woman tried to respond, but the older woman struck again, this time more confidently and with intent. The cane struck her arm again, causing her to cry out in pain. The crowd, until then frowning in fear and inaction, finally began to become active. Some eyes lit up with sparks of admiration, others with confusion, but they all witnessed an elderly woman, tired of humiliation, finally rise up. "You may think you're better, but I know my worth," she shouted, her voice sounding like thunder. The fear she had felt earlier disappeared, replaced by an inner strength. She felt that even if the fall was hard, it was her right to get up and keep fighting. All eyes were on them now, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. People began to whisper, some even encouraged her from behind, but the crowd was still hesitant to intervene. In that moment, the old woman was no longer just a victim. She became a symbol of strength and resilience, fighting for her dignity and the right to be heard. The white woman, now realizing that her power was not so limitless, stepped back, her confidence beginning to melt. Fear gripped her, and she noticed that the crowd, unlike her, was on the older woman's side. Her eyes reflected not only bewilderment, but also confusion. She didn't know what to do next. The white woman stood there, bewildered and shocked, unable to believe her eyes. The elderly black woman, whom she had thought weak and defenseless, was not just a victim, but a real adversary. Her heart pounded, and her mind raced as she tried to understand how things could have changed so dramatically. Her confidence, like a crystal bowl, shattered the moment the cane struck her on the shoulder. She had been so sure of her power that she hadn't even considered the fact that the older woman could not only resist, but also strike back. This unexpected twist threw her off balance, and confusion showed on her face. "How dare you?" she growled, trying to regain control, but her voice sounded shaky and uncertain. She struggled with every word, as if the realization grew inside her that she'd been wrong to underestimate her victim. The people around her began to whisper, some of them throwing approving glances in the older woman's direction, and this only encouraged her confidence. The white woman realized that all these people she thought she could intimidate were now looking at her with contempt. Her inner world began to crack at the seams, and anger and panic boiled in her chest. "You can't just stand up," and she paused, looking at her victim, trying to find the right words, but none of them fit. Fear of losing overwhelmed her, and worse, she realized she couldn't regain her former power so easily. The older woman, who had just gotten a taste of confidence, took a step forward, her cane still clutched tightly in her hands. She could see the white woman beginning to lose control, and it gave her even more strength. "You're not the one who decides who I am," she said, her voice full of strength and dignity. "I've been through many trials in my life, and this is just one of them. You thought you could break me with your violence and hatred, but in fact, you've only awakened strength in me that I didn't even realize I had." Gathering her strength, the white woman began to back away slowly, her confidence melting more and more like ice in the sun. She couldn't afford to show weakness, but the realization that her earlier aggression had turned against her was frightening. "You can't beat me," she shouted, though her voice was full of uncertainty, as if she herself did not believe in her words. The older woman only smiled, knowing that she was not only winning this battle, but raising the voices of all those who had ever suffered from hatred and aggression. The crowd finally began to realize the magnitude of what was happening. They were no longer spectators in this theater of the absurd, but were now part of an important and courageous struggle. The looks on the faces of the spectators changed now. They saw not just a conflict, but a real battle between hatred and resilience, and they all became part of this historic moment. The white woman's state of shock and confusion gradually changed to rage, as soon as she realized that her initial aggression had not only failed to break the spirit of the older black woman, but had provoked a powerful response. Anger boiled up in her. That anger became her only solace, and she began to gather her strength to regain control of the situation. "You think you can stand up and fight me?" she growled, approaching the old woman, her voice full of contempt and hatred. "You're nothing but an old, useless grandmother. I can do whatever I want to you." The crowd around them held its breath again, as if anticipating the denouement. Some began to murmur, condemning the white woman, but others watched with a breathless interest, as if they were spectators in a real theater of violence. The older woman met her gaze. She was prepared for any consequences. "You don't know what real strength is," she said, her voice firm and confident. "You're jealous because your hatred makes you weak." This spurred the white woman on even more. She felt the fear begin to recede, but the hatred only flared up inside her like a fire that needed constant refueling. She could not afford to be defeated, and fury flared in her eyes. "Look at you, you old fool," she shouted, her voice echoing through the crowd, causing tension. "You have no idea what it means to be strong. No one respects you. You're nothing." Her words were full of racist stereotypes and insults that made a feeling of disgust hang in the air. The older woman felt anger boiling up inside her, but she knew she couldn't let it take over. She had already been through many trials in her life, and this was just one more. "You think that humiliating me makes you stronger," she said, taking a step forward into the hate. "But really, you're just showing how hopelessly alone you are in your rage." The crowd began to whisper again, and the atmosphere became heated. Some began to realize that they were witnessing not just a street conflict, but a clash of two worldviews, one filled with hatred and the other filled with resilience and dignity. The white woman, seeing that her words did not have the expected effect, bit her lip in despair. She felt a new wave of anger growing inside her, and the thought of using physical force flashed through her mind. She could have hit again, but the fear that her plan wouldn't work held her back. She struggled with the desire to humiliate and the realization that such an attempt would bring more shame. She was confused, and it was tearing her apart. The old woman stood like a stone wall, adamant, ready to repel any blow the white woman might throw at her. At that moment, everything around them seemed to stop, and the attention of the entire crowd focused on them, waiting to see what would happen next. The older woman, standing on her feet and realizing the full power of her spirit, felt anger and determination overwhelm her. In her heart, she realized that this conflict had long ago gone beyond a personal clash. It was a struggle for dignity, for the right to be heard and respected, regardless of skin color or age. "You don't know what true strength is," she said, her voice sounding confident and loud, as if she were addressing not only the white woman, but the entire crowd that had witnessed the confrontation. "You think you can intimidate people with your hatred, but you don't realize that true strength lies in the ability to stand up when you are beaten." These words became an impulse for her. She felt the urge not only to defend herself, but to speak up for all those who had ever suffered such humiliation. She took a step forward and, gripping the cane tightly, suddenly struck a powerful blow. The cane crashed to the ground, creating a sound that echoed through the street. The white woman, not expecting such an attack, tried to dodge, but her own hatred and aggression proved to be to her advantage. The old woman was not going to stop. She knew that in this struggle, despite all the scars and blows of fate, her strength was not in avoiding conflict, but in standing up for herself. "You can't break me," she shouted, her voice sounding like a warrior's. She swung her cane, lifting it into the air and pointing it toward her assailant. This movement caused a wave of approval from those watching. The crowd, realizing that they were witnessing the unfolding of a battle between dignity and oppression, began to revive. Some began to cheer the elderly woman, shouting words of encouragement to her. Their voices were like an extra strength, and she felt it gave her confidence. The white woman, seeing that her strategy wasn't working, tried to take another step back, but that only irritated the older woman. She was not going to back down. The older woman, using her cane again, quickly and accurately aimed at the white woman, her movements full of agility and determination. "Did you think you could defeat me with hate alone?" she shouted, her voice full of energy. "I've been through so much more than you can imagine." With every stroke of the cane and every word that flew at the white woman, the older woman felt herself gaining respect and dignity. Her every movement told her that her age and appearance did not define her strength. She was fighting not only for herself, but for all those who felt the same feelings of depression and humiliation. At that moment, the whole place was filled with electricity. People began to react to what was happening, supporting her with exclamations. The elderly woman felt that she had a power that transcended any physical aggression. She became a symbol of hope and resistance, inspiring those around her that even in the most difficult times one can find courage and resilience. Neighboring eyes filled with admiration looked at her, and that only spurred her on. She was not just fighting for her dignity, she was inspiring those around her to believe in themselves and to rise up despite the odds. The situation on the street reached a breaking point. Emotions ran high to the point where the spectators could not stay away. The elderly woman, full of determination, continued to demonstrate her strength, while the white woman, who had already realized that her hatred was not producing the expected results, was increasingly losing control. Suddenly, a rumble of discontent and confusion rose among the spectators. The crowd realized that the incident was not just an ordinary quarrel, it was a potentially dangerous situation that could lead to unpredictable consequences. Signs of anxiety began to appear on people's faces. Some began to whisper, fearing for the fate of both women. Someone watching, incandescent with fear, finally snatched up a cell phone and pressed the call button. The sound of signals blaring in the background was like thunder. The people around them stopped, and the tension was building. Every word, every action seemed meaningful, as if time stood still waiting to see what would happen next. "I'm calling the police," someone in the crowd shouted, and the words hung in the air like a sentence. It was like a drop breaking the swamp. The crowd, full of emotion, realized that things had gone too far, and while the elderly woman fought for her dignity, the fear that police intervention might make things worse began to affect the atmosphere. "Please don't do this," shouted another witness, trying to stop the panic from spreading. "This is not what we need." Meanwhile, the white woman, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, felt a new wave of fear come over her. The sound of sirens, which was growing in the distance, made her heart beat faster. She didn't know what awaited her, but she realized she couldn't afford to be trapped by her own actions. Her aggression had already turned against her, and now she knew there was no more advantage left on her side. The elderly woman, noticing the crowd beginning to panic, had mixed feelings. On the one hand, she realized that help might be needed, but on the other hand, she felt that her fight for dignity and justice could now be jeopardized by the intervention of the authorities. "I will not give up," she said, looking at the white woman with renewed determination. "I will fight to the end, no matter who comes." But the fear in the air was becoming palpable. People began to exchange anxious glances, and some began to back away, as if expecting something terrible to happen. The sirens grew louder and louder, and soon police cars began to arrive on the scene, their bright lights flickering, creating a stark contrast to the dark emotions around them. With every second, the tension grew, and the older woman realized that her fight for dignity could now be investigated. She could not afford to give up. This was not just her fight, it was a battle for the voices of those who also suffered from aggression and hatred. Her resolve was stronger than ever, and she knew that no matter what happened next, she would stand her ground. The white woman, feeling the world around her begin to crumble, instantly realized that her aggressive actions had consequences she could not ignore. She saw the growing crowd of people pointing fingers at her, and in their gazes she could read condemnation and dislike. The sound of approaching sirens became an increasingly sullen reminder that she would not be able to hide from her actions. "I'm not going to stay here," she whispered under her breath, looking around for an escape route. Her heart pounded with fear as she turned and tried to make her way through the crowd. Each step felt heavy, as if her legs were filled with lead. She realized that the witnesses had already seen her start the fight first, and that she faced not just condemnation, but real responsibility. "Get out of the way!" she shouted, but her voice was full of despair, and no one paid any attention to her. The people who had just watched her aggressive actions now stood still, as if waiting for the next thing to happen. The elderly woman, noticing that her aggressor was trying to escape, felt a surge of strength. She could not let her escape unpunished, and her resolve grew. She knew that her actions could have consequences, but for her it was not only a matter of personal dignity, but also of justice. "You can't just walk away," she shouted, trying to keep the confidence in her voice. "You have to answer for your actions." Her words echoed through the crowd, and someone in the audience nodded in support. This gave her even more confidence as she stepped forward, raising her cane as if to show that she was not afraid of conflict. The white woman, seeing that her victim was not going to give up, stopped and looked back. The police were closing in, and she had no way out. She could feel the tension building around her, and fear swept over her like icy waves. "I need to leave," she muttered to herself, but fear stopped her in her tracks. The older woman and the crowd were in her way, and she realized that her actions could not be without consequences. Her attempt to escape didn't work. She ran into people who were not going to let her go. Several witnesses nearby began to voice their displeasure, pointing out what they had seen. One of the men standing in the crowd approached her and said, "You have nowhere to run. You have to take responsibility for your actions." These words, spoken with determination, made the white woman freeze. She felt the fear and panic begin to rise, and a realization flashed in her eyes that she had nowhere else to go. The police sirens were getting closer and closer, and at that moment, she realized that her actions could have serious consequences. The elderly woman, standing still, felt her strength only increasing with each passing second. This moment was not just her fight, but a moment for all those who have ever suffered racism and aggression. The crowd began to support her, and at that moment, their voices became a united front against hatred and aggression. The elderly woman realized that now she was not alone. With her stood everyone who had ever experienced such humiliation, and this support gave her more strength than ever before. The sirens grew louder and louder, filling the streets with a disturbing echo. When the police cars finally arrived on the scene, their bright lights began to flicker, reflecting in the eyes of the gathered people. The crowd, previously full of tension and anticipation, was now even more anxious, and fear filled the air like a thick fog. The elderly woman stood at attention, her cane clutched tightly in her hand. She knew that her struggle for dignity and respect would now be subject to the assessments of those who were supposed to be protecting her, but she also knew that at this moment everything could turn against her. The policemen got out of their cars, and their confident steps seemed to cause even more anxiety among those gathered. The officers exchanged brief glances, their faces expressing concentration and wariness, when they noticed an elderly woman with a cane. However, her agent's skin color were instantly subject to assumptions based on racial stereotypes. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked sharply, heading towards the elderly woman. His voice was full of authority, and it left no room for doubt. "Why are you here, old lady?" A huge weight of prejudice and stereotyping loomed over the situation. The officers had no idea what exactly had happened, but their instincts told them that this woman was exactly the element of concern. Their attitudes toward her came not from facts, but from patterns based on experience and bias. The older woman felt everything inside her clench with fear. She opened her mouth to explain, but her voice sounded quiet and trembled with emotion. I was just defending myself," she said, but her words were like an exclamation, swallowed up by the noise of the crowd. The crowd that had been cheering her on before was now beginning to hold its breath. sensing the conflict building. Other police officers noticed a white woman standing a little to the side, and, to her surprise, they started asking her questions, not paying attention to the fact that she was the one who had initiated the conflict. "What happened here?" another officer asked, turning to the white woman, her face, "Are you okay?" That moment when they turned to her, as if resurrecting her in the eyes of the audience, was the beginning of another tense moment. The white woman, trapped by her own actions, felt fear creep into her heart. She knew she had to justify her actions, and not wanting to be made to look guilty, she began to form her own version of events. "She attacked me," she shouted, pointing at the elderly woman. "I was just defending myself." These words, spoken with sincere indignation, caused the officers to be bewildered. The elderly woman felt her heart clench with despair. This was not just an accusation, it was racial stereotyping in action, and she realized that her entire struggle could be undone in a matter of seconds. "Believe me, I know what it looks like," one of the officers said, his face showing more than curiosity. It was a show of confidence that he knew who the real troublemaker was. An elderly woman felt her world beginning to crumble. She realized that her long and arduous journey towards respect and justice might be in jeopardy. Although the flame of struggle still burned in her soul, reality and racial stereotypes suddenly stood in her way. The assembled spectators began to whisper, and the tension in the air was becoming unbearable. The white woman stood, her face no longer confident, but now her voice was louder than ever, and she tried to twist away, using every opportunity to justify herself. The older woman, for her part, felt her position weakening. It was a moment when the whole situation reached a new level of tension, and each side expected justice from the police officers, even though each was looking at the world through the prism of their preconceived beliefs. The officers arrived and began questioning witnesses, and the tension in the air became even more palpable. People in the crowd came forward one by one, ready to tell what they had seen, but in the process, the struggle for truth was overshadowed by the bias of some witnesses and police officers alike. The first to come out was a middle-aged man with a tense face. He was clearly trying to look convincing, but there was a note of doubt in his voice. "I saw that old woman start all this," he began, pointing at the older woman. "She was the one who threw herself at her first. I don't know what happened, but her behavior was strange." These words pierced the crowd, and some began to whisper. The elderly woman felt her heart clench. How could someone who had witnessed her struggle for dignity say such a thing? She tried to look at him hopefully, but instead saw only his indifference based on racial prejudice. The next to approach the microphone was a young woman with a look of sympathy in her eyes. She was obviously worried about the elderly woman and wanted her voice to sound louder amidst the general clamor. "I saw that woman attack her first," she said, pointing to the white woman. "It was horrible, and no one should treat an elderly person like that, regardless of skin color." Some of the witnesses nodded in agreement, but voices were still heard among the crowd trying to minimize what had happened. One man, who was standing a little to the side, said, "I mean, she's black, and this is all just because they're always looking for conflict." These words sent shockwaves through the audience, and the elderly woman seemed to feel the world crumbling even more. Each step she took towards the truth became more and more difficult, and the support she had hoped to receive began to melt away. The police officers, listening to the testimony, also began to demonstrate their own prejudicial attitudes. One of the officers, apparently not noticing how it sounded, uttered, "Well, you know, old people can get a little crazy sometimes. Maybe she had her reasons." These words perplexed the other witnesses. At the moment when justice should have been upheld, the voice of one of the officers became another obstacle to the truth. The old woman felt her strength draining away. Hope and despair battled in her soul as she realized that even in such an obvious case, racial bias could obscure the obvious. The other witnesses began to glance around, sensing how each attempt to tell the truth was met with misunderstanding and distrust. Some of them began to doubt their own impressions, and this added fuel to the already existing confusion. When the next witness approached the microphone, the elderly woman took a deep breath, preparing herself for the possibility that her voice might not be heard. She realized that every detail mattered in this fight for the truth, but with each statement, her hopes faded. The situation continued to escalate, and each new witness only emphasized how difficult it was to move beyond racial stereotypes and see a person in their true light. The elderly woman realized that her struggle was not only for herself, but for those who did not have the opportunity to speak out. She felt her voice needed to be heard, but fear and bias became her opponents in this battle for justice. The elderly woman, standing in the midst of all this confusion, realized that she needed to raise her voice higher than ever before. She could feel the fear and doubt eating away at her from the inside out, but deep inside her soul burned a flame of determination. It was now or never. Staring straight into the eyes of the policeman, she summoned up all her courage and, in a shaky but confident voice, began to speak. "It wasn't my fault what happened," she said, and her words sounded like a challenge. "I was just walking down my road when that woman attacked me. I will not let anyone humiliate me because of the color of my skin or my age." The crowd around her frowned, and even the policeman seemed to stop for a moment to hear her. It wasn't just anger in her voice, but the strength with which she defended her dignity. She knew this was her chance, and she wasn't going to miss it. "I deserve respect, just like everyone here," she continued, looking into the eyes of each of the witnesses and officers. "What happened was wrong. It's wrong to hurt another person just because of their appearance. I may be elderly, but that doesn't make me weak." Her words caused waves of approval among some of the witnesses, who began to nod in agreement. She felt herself rising to her feet, as if age and appearance no longer mattered. In that moment, she became a symbol of resilience for anyone who had ever faced bias and aggression. The officers exchanged glances as they listened to her. One of them seemed to begin to realize that their initial assessment of the situation might have been wrong. "Are you saying she attacked you?" he clarified, making his words more serious. "Can you describe exactly what happened?" "She pushed me and started insulting me," the older woman replied, gathering all her memories of that terrible moment. "I wasn't going to stand for it, and when she hit me, I hit her back. It wasn't just a response, it was a defense of my dignity." Saying this, she felt all her worries. Fear and humiliation gradually turned into a powerful wave. It was not just her struggle. It was more than that. It was a confrontation of hatred in which she was not alone. There were people around her who supported her, and that gave her strength. Some of the policemen finally began to show interest in her story. Their gazes were no longer full of distrust, but rather of concentration. One of them leaned closer and asked, "Are you sure you want to continue? You can contact a lawyer if necessary." The older woman nodded, realizing that her words could cause repercussions, but now she couldn't back down. She felt that their attention was allowing her to push her boundaries and forcing her to speak the truth. "I'm ready to go on," she said, her voice firm. "I want everyone to know that no one should tolerate this kind of attitude, no matter their age or skin color. We are all human beings, and we are entitled to respect." Those words were like thunder in the silence. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending all those who had ever felt humiliated and abandoned. Her words resonated in the hearts of those who heard, and in that moment, she felt that her struggle could be the spark for change. Changes began to show on the faces of the witnesses and officers. They began to realize the depth of her pain and courage. In that moment, the elderly woman became a symbol of fortitude and resilience. And although the battle had not yet been won, she knew that her voice had been heard. Now, standing in front of the police, she wasn't just a victim, she was a fighter, and her righteousness could bring change. As if under the influence of an invisible force, the white woman began to realize that her actions had led to irreversible consequences. As she listened to the older woman loudly and confidently defend her dignity, her arrogance slowly changed to fear. Her heart beat faster, and she felt a cold sweat covering her forehead. She realized that her original plan of playing the victim and avoiding responsibility would not work. The older woman, with her firmness and determination, had become not just an adversary, but a real threat to her own well-being. The crowd around her began to whisper judgmentally, and the white woman finally realized that she had lost control of the situation. Fear gripped her, and she felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. Was her aggression just an attempt to prove her strength? She now realized that her actions had put her in a very negative light. "You don't understand what I meant," she stammered, trying to justify her actions, but her voice sounded less and less confident. She made attempts to find the words that could save her, but they eluded her. I don't know what came over me." Her panic increased as the officers began to ask her questions. Each question seemed to cut her off from reality. and she began to realize that all her actions would be scrutinized. She felt guilty for what she had done, but even more frightened by how she might be perceived by society. "How can you treat a woman of her age like that?" one of the policemen asked, his voice harsh and demanding. "Do you really think your behavior is justified?" The corners of the white woman's lips quivered as she realized that her previous attempts to justify herself hadn't worked. Now she was the center of attention, and all eyes were on her. As if under the weight of those eyes, her confidence shattered and she looked like a defeated person. "I didn't mean to," she began, but her voice was no longer convincing. The inner conflict between fear and remorse raged within her. Her aggressive actions didn't seem to make sense anymore, and now she realized that the outcome could be completely unpredictable. They began to whisper, and the crowd looked more and more like the audience on the stage of a theater, where a drama was unfolding. The white woman suddenly felt her fear turn into self-hatred. She tried to find support among the audience, but when faced with rejection and condemnation, she realized that her surroundings were not on her side. At that moment, her inner monologue was interrupted as one of the police officers leaned closer to her. "You will have to answer for your actions," he said, his voice ruthless. "We will investigate, and you will have to explain what happened." Fear appeared in her eyes. She realized that her arrogance and aggression, which had once seemed like strength, had become her greatest weakness. Afraid that her life would be turned upside down, she noticed a new perception forming around her. Her image, once defined as an aggressive white woman, was now increasingly associated with an unworthy victim. I just didn't know what I was doing," she said desperately. But no one was listening. The people around her were getting tired of her excuses. They had already drawn their own conclusions. Anxiety and confusion overwhelmed her as she realized that her life could now be in the hands of those she had humiliated. Fearing that the consequences of her actions could tear her life apart, the white woman was left alone in this circle of judgment, surrounded by an atmosphere of fear and reluctance. Fear became her new companion, and the arrogance that had once driven her left only emptiness and bitterness. She knew now that her actions would forever change not only her, but also the life of an older woman with whom she could essentially no longer compete. Shortly after the witness interviews were completed, the police began to gather to discuss the situation and come to a conclusion. The crowd waited nervously, watching the officers talk amongst themselves. The tension in the air was becoming almost palpable, and many of those present began to realize that the impending verdict could have a serious impact on everyone involved in that incident. The old woman stood with clenched fists, ready for what was about to happen. She knew that not only her honor but justice in general depended on this decision. Inside her, hope flared that despite racial bias and inequality, her voice would still be heard. The police officers, gathered in a circle, began a discussion. One of the officers, who had earlier questioned the white woman, took the lead. "So we have two versions of events, one from an elderly woman who claimed she was the victim of aggression, and the other from a woman who seems to be trying to minimize her behavior." He paused, then continued. "We also have statements from several witnesses, some of whom show bias." The words bias pierced the air like a lightning strike. The elderly woman felt her heart clench as she realized that bias could affect this case. She remembered how some witnesses had tried to diminish the significance of her experience, as if her suffering didn't matter. Another officer, tall and with a serious expression, nodded, adding, "We must keep in mind that any incident of this nature requires a fair analysis. However, given that the white woman was the first to initiate physical violence, this should play an important role in our decision." As the old woman heard these words, she felt hope rekindle in her. Perhaps justice would be served after all. But still the atmosphere remained tense. The police officers began to discuss exactly how to present their findings. One of them said, "If we decide to arrest her, it could cause a public outcry. Some people in the crowd are already showing bias in their testimony, and this could lead to further conflicts. We have to be careful." These words threw the elderly woman into confusion. She knew that this decision would not only be about her, but about all those who had ever faced a similar situation. Justice should not depend on fear of public reaction, but it was that fear that was now constraining the police. "We have to be prepared for the consequences if this gets out," said one of the officers. "But if we don't take action, we are sending a message that this behavior is acceptable." Watching the policemen, the elderly woman realized that they were in a difficult position. Each of them realized that they not only had to make a decision, but they had to do it right. Yet there was a feeling in the air that bias might take over. When they finally came to a conclusion, the crowd frowned in anticipation. The policemen returned to the group of people, ready to announce their decision. The officers who first started the discussion said with a serious expression on his face, "We have reached a conclusion, and that decision will be based on the evidence and facts gathered." He paused, looking at those present, and the older woman felt her heart sink in anticipation. "We decided that the white woman would be detained and prosecuted for physical abuse." The reaction of the crowd was instantaneous. Some breathed a sigh of relief. Others began to whisper, and uncertainty hung in the air again. But despite the favorable decision, there was still fear in the older woman's soul. Would it really be a fair decision, or would societal biases end up skewing the results? The enormous weight she carried was still weighing on her, and she knew that this battle was just beginning. Justice required not only a verdict, but also a rethinking of the biases that she and others of similar experience had to face. After the police made their decision, information about the incident quickly spread on local news and social media. The confrontation between the white woman and the elderly black woman became the subject of heated discussions, provoking a variety of reactions in the community. Groups of people began to appear on the streets of the city, gathering for protests, some in favor of supporting the elderly woman, others in favor of exonerating the aggressor. Each new day brought new posters, slogans, and emotions. Society was more divided than ever before, and more people took to the streets to express their opinions about what had happened. Some felt that the police action was completely fair, emphasizing the importance of protecting those who were being harassed, regardless of their age or race. In their eyes, the elderly woman became a symbol of resilience and courage, representing everyone who had ever suffered from prejudice and racism. They demanded justice and stricter measures against those who show aggression. "We are here to show that we will not tolerate violence and hatred in our society," shouted one of the activists at the rally, holding a placard with a picture of an elderly woman and the words "No to Violence." At the same time, other groups, consisting mainly of people who shared the white woman's views, gathered for counter-rallies. They argued that everything was exaggerated and that the public reaction to the incident shows how wrong it is to interpret situations without knowing all the details. She was only defending her rights. One of the participants raised his voice, clenching his fists. "Don't forget that this woman provoked the conflict herself." These words, full of rage and discontent, echoed in the air, fueling the tension. The sense of division grew, and with each new post on social media, discontent flared. Articles appeared covering both sides of the conflict, but they often tilted toward those who opposed the elderly woman. This only exacerbated the bias and gave rise to new attacks on her personality. The elderly woman, being in the center of attention, was under tremendous pressure. She did not know how to respond to this storm of opinions. At first, her support from the community encouraged her, but as the hatred directed at her increased, she began to feel vulnerable. Were her actions the right thing to do, or was she simply taking a path that would lead to more division? In the midst of all this turmoil, she realized that she was not alone. There were those behind her who supported her, and despite all the hatred and aggression, there were still people in the world who were willing to fight for justice. It gave her strength. Despite her fear, she decided to speak out. She recorded a video message in which she told her story. Looking into the camera, she spoke about the importance of standing up to aggression and hatred. "I'm not afraid to speak the truth," she said, her voice full of determination. "We all deserve respect, no matter who we are. Our lives should not be defined by skin color or age." The video quickly went viral on the internet, and many people began sharing it, supporting her words. The feedback was varied, with some expressing solidarity and support, while others criticized her for inciting hatred. In that moment, the elderly woman realized that her voice really mattered. Society was reacting to the incident, but despite all the divisions, there were also new opportunities for unity. She realized that the real fight for justice begins not only with physical confrontation, but also with dialogue that could change opinions and hearts. With each new publication and each new rally, she felt her own power grow. She was no longer just a victim, but part of a broader struggle for rights and respect, which gave her hope that justice would eventually prevail. The incident between an elderly black woman and a white aggressor became more than just a random encounter on the street. It has become a symbol of the struggle for equality and justice, reflecting the underlying issues that have permeated society for decades, both in the small town and beyond. The incident became not only one woman's story, but the beginning of a broader dialogue about racism, bias, and dignity. An elderly woman, whom many have begun to call a symbol of resilience, realized that her personal experience was part of a larger context. Every step she took toward justice inspired others, creating a wave of support and unity among those who also face bias and injustice. She realized that her story, like the stories of so many others, could be a source of strength and inspiration for future generations. The social movements that emerged after the incident brought people from all walks of life together. People of all races and ages began to come out to rallies to show that hatred had no place in their community. They not only supported the elderly woman, but also actively opposed any display of aggression. At every rally, there were cries of equality, justice, and unity, and it made her heart flutter with pride and hope. With each new day, as newspapers published articles and TV stations discussed what had happened, the elderly woman realized that her voice was now being heard by a wider audience. She decided to take it a step further by using her story to educate and inspire others. In her interviews, she shared not only her experience, but also encouraged everyone to protect their rights, regardless of age, race, or appearance. "We all live in the same world, and it should be safe for everyone," she said in an interview. "Each of us has the right to respect and dignity. It is important that we stand together when one of us is under attack." Her words resonated with people's hearts, and more people began to discuss issues that had previously been ignored. Hashtags calling for equality and solidarity sprang up on social media, and their support put pressure on the authorities for change. This support did not go unnoticed. Officials finally began to take action to raise awareness of the problems of racism and prejudice in society. She realized that every conversation, every meeting, and every initiative was an opportunity for change. She began to speak at events, telling her story and explaining the importance of raising her voice, even when it seems that the power to stand up to hate is not enough. "We cannot let fear constrain our actions," she said. "We must teach children that they have a right to be heard and that their voices matter." She began leading seminars and workshops in local schools to teach the younger generation about respect and understanding. She spoke to children about her own experiences and the importance of responding to hate not with aggression, but with understanding and compassion. This approach began to change hearts and minds, shaping a new generation that was ready to confront prejudice and defend the dignity of every human being. In the end, an incident that began as a manifestation of hatred turned into a powerful lesson about the importance of protecting one's dignity. The elderly woman became an example to many, inspiring them to fight for equality and justice. Her resilience reminded everyone that regardless of age, color, or appearance, everyone has the right to respect and dignity. In the final moments of her speech at one of the rallies, she addressed the crowd, her voice full of emotion. This incident was the beginning of change, but it is important to remember that this is only the first step. If we want to create a world where there is no room for hatred, we all need to work together. By protecting each other, we protect ourselves. Let's make our voices heard and let everyone know that they matter and deserve respect. The elderly woman's words became a call to action. People around her began to realize that together they could create a better society where everyone, regardless of race or age, would have the opportunity to live in peace and respect. And this fight for equality that she led became more and more important in the days when fear and hatred seemed to engulf the world. In the end, the lesson learned from this incident was simple but powerful. Dignity and respect are the rights of every human being, and each of us can be an agent of change if we are willing to speak out against hate and protect those who need it. After an incident that was a turning point in the life of an elderly black woman, the world around her changed. Despite the wave of support and acceptance, she still felt the weight of the stress and fear she had experienced. Every day reminded her of the collision that turned her life upside down and the traumas that would stay with her for a long time to come. In the first time after the incident, she had difficulty returning to normal life. Nightmares became her constant companions. She would wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the white woman's face full of hatred and aggression. Every morning began with a heavy feeling that she would have to go out again, where the world that once seemed safe had become a place full of danger. On the streets of her hometown, she now always felt on the lookout. Despite the support she received from friends and activists, fear returned every time she saw a group of people or heard harsh words. People in her surroundings, who had previously seemed familiar, began to seem distant and inaccessible. She noticed that some of them looked at her differently, with sympathy, but also with some wariness. These looks pressed on her, as if they reminded her that she was a victim of violence and hatred. Every once in a while, when she went out to get groceries or just strolled through her neighborhood, dark thoughts would pop into her mind. She wondered what might be the target again. These experiences made her constantly look around, as if every woman walking by could be a potential threat. Deep down, she knew that not all men were violent, but the wound the incident had left was too fresh, and she couldn't let it go easily. Even at home, it was hard for her to relax. The walls of her apartment, which had once seemed safe, now seemed like a prison full of memories of violence and hatred. She began to avoid talking to her friends, fearing that talking about what had happened would only increase her anxiety. Little by little, her life became a vicious circle, where every movement was surrounded by a shadow of fear and mistrust. To cope with her emotions, she started keeping a diary. In it, she described her feelings, fears, and hopes. This helped her to vent, but she also realized that her experiences were part of a larger issue, the struggle against racism and prejudice that Black people face on a daily basis. Sometimes, as she read her notes, she felt a desire inside her to speak out against this unjust world. She realized that her story, though difficult, could help others. Perhaps it would be her experience that would inspire people to fight hatred and prejudice. These thoughts gave her strength, and she decided that she would not let fear rule her life. However, no matter how hard she tried, life continued to throw her difficulties. Often she encountered prejudice even in her daily life. At the store, she was unintentionally hurt by stares, and cashiers sometimes served her with obvious displeasure. She knew it could be the result of stereotyping, but each instance made her angry and resentful. She had to convince herself again and again that it wasn't her fault, and that she had every right to be wherever she wanted. Over time, the elderly woman began to work on herself, trying to find solace in the things that once brought her joy. She returned to her hobbies of painting and gardening, finding time to create. She began to use art as a way to express her feelings. Her paintings became a reflection of the pain and strength she possessed. Each new work became therapy for her, allowing her to draw out and work through all the fears and anxieties she was experiencing. In her garden, surrounded by flowers and plants, she began to find tranquility. With each new sprout that sprouted under her care, she felt her own strength revitalized. Nature became a source of inspiration and healing for her, and she realized that, like her plants, she too could grow and become stronger. Gradually, with the help of therapy and the support of friends, she began to find the strength to talk about her experiences. She started attending support groups where she shared her story and listened to the stories of others. This helped her realize that she was not alone. When faced with racism, many have experienced the same feelings of fear, anger, and pain. Sharing her experiences with others gave her life meaning and helped her to regain her confidence. She realized that her voice mattered, and that she could be a source of change not only for herself but for others as well. Every day, she felt more and more compelled to continue fighting for equality, albeit on other fronts. Now her goal was not only to defend her rights, but also to inspire others to take active action against hatred and bias. Thus, the elderly woman became active in local communities, organizing workshops and seminars to share her experiences and the importance of defending her rights. She began to collaborate with organizations working against racism, and her story became part of their campaigns. As the months passed, she increasingly realized that while the aftermath of the incident had been a heavy burden, it had also been a powerful impetus for change. She became a symbol of resilience for many, and this gave her strength. The older woman realized that her life had been difficult, but that each challenge had only made her stronger and more determined. In the end, the elderly Black woman's life was becoming a path to healing and change. Despite her trials, she could no longer be afraid to take to the streets. It was now her territory, her place to be herself. She was ready to keep fighting, not only for herself, but for all those who face bias and racism. Every day her spirit grew stronger, and she knew she could change the world around her by inspiring others to follow her example. Dear viewers, We are very interested in your opinion about our story. Share in the comments what you think about the topics raised. Have you experienced racism or bias in your life? Your stories are important, and we value every word. Each and every one of you makes a huge difference to us, and we are grateful for your support. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like to help us continue to make content that brings up important topics. We wish you a great day. Thank you for being with us.